So in this first slide, for this first week, I wanted to just kind of pull back for a second, right? Because let's say you took a class in high school or even possibly middle school about the United States government. Or let's say you jumped onto YouTube and watched, a 20-minute video. Or let's say you took a typical textbook, right, by just looking at Amazon, and you said, I'm going to look at the table of contents. Almost all of them throw at you this idea of what would be like a very simplistic history, right? And so they say, well, let's start with the historical context of the United States government. But the question you'd want to ask, especially for this class, is whose history, right? So the image that I gave you over here on the right shows you the ethnic breakdown of the generation right before the American Revolution. And you'll see, right, that there's close to 60% of the population is English heritage. But then you've got kind of a mixture of other groups, right? You've got Scotch-Irish, Germans, Scotch, just Scottish people, the Dutch that were here, much earlier than the English. There's also some Spanish folks, down in the south and then to the west, but right, we're only looking at the American states here. And then, of course, you've got enslaved people from Africa down on, kind of towards the bottom and then the middle. So, you can't simplify the United States history in reality, right? You can do it in a textbook, but you'd need to take one or two classes just to get into the details of all the group conflict, right? And we're not even talking about the American Indians at this point, because that first contact happened, depending on which textbook you're even reading, as early as the 1200s, or if you want to just go with the Columbus story of the 1400s, or you could get into the later visits by the English and the Dutch. So, it's a very complicated story. But if I had to present this in like a super simple way, I just drew like a little diagram here to the left if I was a student, right? So I'd say, okay, what are the structures of the United States government that I'm supposed to remember according to a textbook, right? Well, there's the Supreme Court. And that's what I've got here. SCOTUS is Supreme Court of the United States. And they have two concepts that are typically presented that they want students to know, right? One is this collective idea, like what does it mean to be a United States citizen? How are you supposed to behave? All these kind of questions. And then there's this very different philosophical concept of liberty. And, it's spelled liberté, right? Because it goes back to this ancient Latin and Greek concept, which means like, why do you need a government at all? And these are the two kind of sides, right? So people call, why do I need a government at all? Or what is it good for as freedom? And then the collective is kind of the people who say, well, no, we need to have some kind of a social contract, or we need to defend ourselves against some other group of people. And that's like the basic building block of the structure, right? So then the question is, well, how do you do that? In this country, they made the decision to do that through a constitution. And then the constitution sets up four distinct departments, sometimes called a branch, which is kind of confusing, right? Because the United States is not a tree. But the departments, right? They're like, if you go to a store and you want to go to the men's department, you want to go to the children's department, you want to go to the household department, right? That's how you should think about this. The Constitution gives these like tasks to these different departments. So one of obviously is Congress, right? That's the House of Representatives and the Senate. The other one is, the one you're probably most familiar with, which is the President of the United States. And he or she's got a relationship with the Pentagon, right? So that's Department of Defense. But then you've got these things that people, rarely talk about in the textbook, which are, the majority of the states and then the minority of the states, right? And that's a real important thing to remember because of that complicated history that you look at to the right. The majority of the states going into 1776 were English. The minority were these kind of more mixed groups. And the mixed groups had a very different idea about slavery, for example. They thought it was okay, largely because they're maintaining that classic Greek ideal of freedom. Like if you don't want to be a slave, then you'll figure out how not to be a slave. Whereas the states in the North have a much more conscientious idea of collective, right? And so there's kind of this English versus non-English kind of point of view already embedded in the Constitution. So the main thing that you kind of want to try to remember is that the 13 colonies, they have documents that have been given by the King of England to establish one of two things. They're either doing this because of some religious reason, right? They're Puritans, or they want to start a city on the hill, or they want to have, in the case of Maryland, they want to have a Catholic state. And these are, social experiments basically on, how can you start a religious state? There's some irony now in like today when people criticize places like Saudi Arabia or Iran, when that was the North in the United States. They were started as religious states. It took a much longer time for them to start to divide the state from the religion. But in the South, I mean, to be blunt, it was all about money. And this is easily found right on YouTube. But you could look at like the East Indian Company, the Dutch Company, right? There's all these companies, and this is really where slavery is, a profit center, right? So in places like Virginia and South Carolina, this is the heart of the slave economic trade. And it's important that, people are making money on the buying and selling of slaves, but they're also making money on slaves producing cotton, tobacco, corn, right? There's all these things that everyday people are buying, right? So that economic system obviously still exists today. And it's hard for students to accept that reality. But of course there are slaves, right? I mean, this is like how it's a very well-known concept if you take an ancient philosophy class or a modern political science class, that you can't have a civilized economic situation like we have today without slaves, right? And some people would like that, like Elon Musk and others would like those slaves to be computers and machines, right? Nonetheless, right, they're still slaves. But in any case, right, there has to be some kind of hierarchy is the argument. And this is really what, leads us to this idea of the English copy, right? That was the King of England, right, had the king's court, and then there was this hierarchy, right? So it starts with this person at the top, and then you kind of gradually have very specific powers as you go on down, to the bottom, right, to whatever that is. And this idea was that, people accepted this reality. So if you were born a slave, you were supposed to stay a slave. If you were born a peasant, you're supposed to stay a peasant. There was no sense of like moving up like people, think about today. And then this also feeds into that concept that you might have memorized the description of, but you didn't know what it meant, federalism, right? Where sure, there's sharing of power, and certainly there's checks and balances. But again, the English concept was that there was a hierarchy, right? So the person who had the most duty and responsibility was the king. And in this case, it's very confusing, I think, if you're new to the United States. That's supposed to be Congress, right? So the parliament or the legislators are supposed to have the most power. And that's why the Constitution starts with them and starts giving them all their duties and saying what they have to do. And then each kind of, department then kind of has a different task to do. And this was all negotiated by the Congress at the Constitutional Convention. As a result of the Declaration of Independence. It's like, we're gonna challenge the hierarchy in England. So now what are we gonna do? How are we going to govern ourselves? And that was really the big question and the experiment of this time period. But go back to that, picture on the right. It's not one side, right? There's a bunch of people with a bunch of different ideas on what they think what self-government should look like. And that's why you have 13 very different states. And that's why you have 50 plus District of Columbia, plus Puerto Rico, plus America Samoa, governments. They all run very differently. Sure, there's some similarities, say, between New York and California, but if you were to go to South Dakota, you'd see it's totally different, or Idaho, right? And so it's a very complicated idea that can't be simplified into a historical context of the United States. So I want you to just understand from the very beginning, it's like a fight, right? Everybody's kind of got their own agenda, and so checks and balances is a nice idea. It's adorable. Wouldn't it be nice? But it's not real, right? It's more like a seesaw, right? Where one group of people is going to have more power. They're going to take more of the resources, and that's like pretty common sense if you really stop to think about it. But that really occurs at the majority of the states. That's not really something that happens as obviously in Congress or the president or the Supreme Court. That's what people focus on because of the media. But in reality, it's really the states where all the action is, which is, of course, obviously, if you thought about it, right? You live in New York State. You don't really care about what happens in Oklahoma. So I just want you to kind of understand that basic structure from the very beginning, because the more knowledge you have about these details, the better you're going to understand how the United States government works. And then, the final thing I'll think about is like, now the largest group of people in the United States government are actually the agents of the executive, right? So the people who work in the Department of Homeland Security, the people who work for the Department of State, Department of, notice what word I'm using here, right? Department. So again, I don't know why we always say branches when that doesn't even really make any sense. But now there's all these people, and you might be one of these people. A lot of you who are criminal justice majors would like to work for the FBI, right? That's a department. And so that's now, the new majority, or what Donald Trump called the deep state. Those are the collective kind of groups that are now kind of competing for power. So when you think of checks and balances, it's not so much like between Idaho and Wyoming, as much as it is from like the Department of Defense and the Department of State, right? Because they're competing for tax dollars in the budget process. And so I don't want to go into too many more details, because I just really want you to understand that's the structure. If it kind of sounds like it's like WWF wrestling, it kind of is, right? People are just kind of jumping into the ring, and they're all competing, and they're struggling for influence. They're struggling for resources. So it's not as simple to say as like who gets what, right? Because that's too complicated. It's too complicated to say who is who, because each kind of group is going to define themselves over time. Even, you see that what is the real difference between the Scot-Irish and the Scotch, right? Having that as part of my background, I can tell you not much in 2020. But maybe in 1739 that was a big difference, right? There was the Scottish Enlightenment, which was very different than the European Enlightenment, and so there might be some differences. But by 2021, that influence is only left over in the fact that there's like this struggle for influence, and that's really the main thing that I want you to understand. So you want to start thinking about role power.